Okay, welcome to the 5th video on the 3rd meditation. In this video, we're going to be discussing continuing the discussion of the first proof of God's existence. We saw in the last video how 2, 4, 5, and 6 follow, and that what's left to be shown is these guys here, right? That I have an idea of God, what that idea contains, namely all of the perfections, and that I cannot be the cause of my idea of God, and that nothing like me, nothing finite, can be the cause of this idea. So that's what we're going to do in this video. We're going to see how Descartes thinks those are all working. So beginning now with that I have an idea of God. I mean, you might wonder, well, does Descartes just assume that we have an idea of God? And does Descartes just assume that that idea of God contains all of the perfections? I mean, in a way he does, but you should ask, why can he do this? I mean, and why do we have that idea rather than the idea of a being that's great that we can imagine by negating or extending all of the finite perfections of a human being? Well, let's take that I have the idea of God first. So Descartes' thought is that I desire knowledge, right? I, the meditator, desire knowledge. I don't have it, right? I'm imperfect. I'm a finite being. I don't know everything that there is to know. But to desire knowledge, I must also have a conception of what it is to be better, to have more knowledge, right? So I must have an idea of what it would be to be perfect in knowing. So to find out whether you have, in fact, improved, you have to have a standard by which you can first understand what it is to improve. And this standard is a conception of what you want, the best, the most perfect knowledge. Thus, you have to have a notion of perfect knowledge, the best possible knowledge. That is, you have to have an idea of omniscience, perfect, complete knowledge. And omniscience is going to be the first property of God. This is the property of God that's your standard of improvement in regards to your knowledge. This is the standard of truth. Further, you also realize that you could be better in other ways, say morally better. For these realizations, you also need a conception of those perfections, right? What it is to be perfectly good. And in general, thinking of the better is parasitic on thought of the best. Right? Thought of the best provides the standard by which you measure your progress in becoming better, right? It's through an idea of the best that you measure your progress towards the best. And so it's through the idea of the best that you measure what it is to become better. And since God is a perfect being, the idea of God will be of a being that contains all of the perfections. So, both I have an idea of God, right? Because I know that I'm imperfect in various ways, and because my idea of God is my idea of that which contains all of the perfections, I'll have an idea of God, the most perfect being, the being that contains all perfections, the perfect being. So to really understand what this idea of God amounts to, however, we need to examine the contrast between how we know and how God knows. So how does God know? Well, God certainly knows himself, right? God clearly has an idea of himself. I mean, think here of Exodus 3:14. What is Exodus 3:14? Well, at Exodus 3:14, it's written, God says, I am what I am. Right? Moses is talking to God, and God says, I am what I am. So God is what God is and knows this, right? God knows I am what I am. And so, I mean, I exist is just a small image, a reflection, a parody of God's knowledge of what God is. I exist is just an image of God's knowledge, of God's self. God is not a perfect knower because God conforms to the things that he knows, right? That would make God dependent on something outside of himself. I mean, that's the way that we know things, right? I know my water bottle is gray because my mind conforms to my water bottle. I know my water bottle is cylindrical because my water bottle, my idea conforms to my water bottle. But God's not like that, right? God's not dependent on the things that he knows in the way that my knowledge is dependent on the things that I know. God does not turn his binoculars onto existence and look at it representing it. I mean, that would open up all sorts of skeptical questions about God's knowledge and whether his faculties for knowledge or his faculties for representing are up to the task of having the knowledge that they purport to have. But the fact that those skeptical objections would open up is enough to show that that can't be how God's knowledge works, right? Because that would make God's knowledge imperfect. But God's knowledge is perfect. It's the standard of knowledge. So there can be no question of whether it's correct. Rather, God knows all things because he knows his will to create. He knows what he's made, his creative acts. So he doesn't check out all things. He doesn't turn his binoculars onto them. Rather, he just knows his will. Right? So when I have an idea and I will it, then I make it so, right? So if I will that the water bottle be lifted, then I lift the water bottle. So if I will that the water bottle be lifted, then I lift the water bottle. And so the objective reality of my thought, will the water bottle to be lifted, becomes real in the world, right? So through my will, I have a way of making my idea real. And that's not the way God works, right? There isn't some separation between God's willing and the act of making it so. For God, there's no divide between thinking, willing, and doing. All of these are one simple act. And this comes out at Principles, section 22. Right? So for God, thinking, willing, and doing are all one simple act. As soon as God thinks, God wills, and God does, there's no separation. God doesn't first have to think the water bottle be lifted and then make it real. Rather, in the thinking, there is the doing. And so this is why God is the standard of knowledge. To say that God is the intellectual standard is just to say that God necessarily knows. God is the source of everything, the absolute first principle. Whatever is from God. The standard of knowledge is the source of truth. Since God created all things, and sustains all things. So God is that source of truth. So the source of truth is what creates all things and sustains all things. And this means that all of the skeptical problems that arise for our knowledge don't arise here. For example, God cannot be deceived by an evil deceiver. Since God created and creates all things, God knows the things by knowing his own will. And since he sets the standard of what it is to know, it would make no sense for him to be deceived. And as a result, God's knowledge is the perfect standard for truth. God is like a king. A king is not subject to laws, but is the maker of laws. God is perfect law. God has perfect jurisdiction because he makes the laws. And so God is also perfect power. So from recognizing his omniscience and how it works through knowing what it creates, you can reason almost immediately to God's omniscience, right? So God knows all because God makes all. God creates everything. God knows it because he creates it, because he knows his own will, right? So because God is omniscient, and the most perfect kind of knowledge is to know it as it's been created, God is also perfect. It's also all powerful, all omnipotent, right? And so this is the best way of knowing things. So if God wasn't omnipotent, then he wouldn't be the best possible knower. But he is the best possible knower, and so he's omnipotent, right? So that's how we get from omniscience to the second quality of God, omnipotence. And so on, right, for the other perfections. Okay, so that's enough about 1 and 2. Let's move now to 3 and 4. So Descartes considers 4 possible sources for my idea of God. How are these working? Well, God does not possess an indefinitely large amount of knowledge, goodness, and power. Rather, God possesses all of these perfections in an infinite degree. And we're going to be able to set aside all other possible sources of my idea of God because none of them are going to be infinite. Rather, they can only be indefinitely great. Okay. So God possesses all the perfections in an infinitely large amount, but any finite thing is only going to be able to have indefinitely much perfection in it. So a relevant analogy is going to be the mathematical analogy, the difference between a potential and an actual infinity, right? We can imagine indefinitely great finite things, and that imagining is potentially infinite, but it's not actually infinite. But God is going to have the perfections actually. He's going to have an actual infinity of the perfections. So the series of natural numbers is conceived as indefinitely extendable, never reaching a final element. And the set or collection of all natural numbers, which contains more elements than can be counted by any finite number. But if we could only extend our own finite perfections, our own type of knowledge, we could only get some indefinite amount. We could never get to an actual infinite quantity, actual omniscience, or actual omnipotence, right? So we can only get to indefinitely large knowledge or indefinitely large power. We can never get to the quality of actual omniscience or actual omnipotence. So that's going to be the problem with the 4 other possible sources of the idea of God. So could I have made the idea of God? Could I have been the cause of my idea of God? Well, I have an idea of the infinite knower. I have an idea of a finite knower, me. Maybe I got the idea of the infinite knower from negating my idea of the finite knower, right? So maybe I got my idea of God in that way. Well, that's not going to work. Take the ideas of the perfect and imperfect. You can only think of yourself as imperfect if you already have an idea of the perfect. You can only get to an imperfect idea, or if you already have the idea, if you already have a perfect idea. So you can't get to it through negation, right? So you can't get to the idea of an infinite perfect being like God through negating the idea of an imperfect being like yourself. But what if I am myself a potential God, right? So Descartes considers that on page 47, right? So perhaps I'm something greater than I myself understand. And all of the perfections which I attribute to God are somehow in me potentially, though not yet emerging or actualized. For I am now experiencing a gradual increase in my knowledge, and I see nothing prevents its increasing more and more to infinity. Further, I see no reason why I should not be able to use this increased knowledge to acquire all of the other perfections of God. And if the potentiality of these perfections is already in me, why should not this be enough to generate the idea of such perfection? So I seem to have the capacity to become the perfect knower. I have, after all, been perfecting my knowledge steadily since I started meditating. Perhaps from this idea of my improvement, I can extrapolate the idea of my being potentially God. I am the potential God. Shiver. But that's impossible. To become perfect is itself an imperfection. That we have to meditate to become perfect is a sign of our imperfection, our lack. God is perfect. He has never been a beginner in knowledge. He has never lacked knowledge. He has known and created existence always and forever. But since I can at best only become perfect, I am not God, or as powerful as God. And so my idea of God cannot come from me in this way. So yet, if I derive my existence, here's Descartes' reply, yet if I derive my existence from myself, then I should neither doubt nor want nor lack anything at all. For I should have given myself all the perfection which I have any idea, and thus I should myself be God, right? So I am the potential God. And if I was potentially God, then I would already be God. But I'm not God. And so I didn't give these ideas of the perfections to myself. Well, what if I attain this idea through my own progress? I mean, that's sort of also contained in this, right? I'm progressing. You couldn't form the idea of an adult human being by reflecting on children, nor could you form the idea of a butterfly if you only knew caterpillars. From the idea of a potential being, you can't get the idea of a perfect being. I mean, that's Descartes' thought here, right? And so you're not going to be able to get the idea of a perfect infinity merely from the idea of progressing towards infinity. Well, what if a malicious demon, turning now to the 4th idea, right? What if a malicious demon was the source of my idea? What if some other finite thing like that demon was the cause of my idea? Well, suppose the demon is not God, but some little demon, some finite demon. But then to give me the idea of God, he must have that idea. But such a little malicious demon is like me, just a little bit more powerful. So where did the demon get the idea from? And all of the arguments that we've already been through start all over again. So this is going to hold for all of the things in the world, since all of those things are finite. So there's no imperfect thing in the world from which I could derive this perfect idea. So with the proof of God, we can now see a further reason why the idea of God is innate. This reason is that to be a thinking thing is to have an idea of God who by his nature as God exists. This is because a thinking thing is either infinite, in which case it's God, and knows itself to be God, or it is finite, in which case it knows itself to be finite and measures its lack of knowledge against the idea it has of perfect knowledge. In this way, if you don't have an idea of God, you don't count as thinking. So the idea of God must be innate in thinking things. Right? So any thinking thing will have an idea of God. Okay, as we've seen, since God's existence can be proved from the existence of this idea of God, for there to be thinking, God must exist. This means that for there to be doubt, and the kind of radical doubt of the first meditation, there must be God. So unless you've understood this, you've not understood what thinking is. Any thinking being is going to have such an idea of God, and if there's an idea of God, God must exist. And so if you haven't understood that God exists in this way, as an infinite, is the infinite knower and the infinite being that created all things, then you haven't understood what thinking is. And so God is the immense light in which the natural light of my reason has its origin. Now, in case you've not been persuaded by the first proof of God's existence, Descartes offers a different form of the causal argument. And it's supposed to be more easily graspable, like the image of the demon was more easily graspable. And we'll turn to that second proof in the next video.